two of us welcome you here today. And we're here to talk about this book and the importance of rest and the importance of, especially now as we seem to be sort of gearing back up in some way, the importance of prioritizing what you need, the cadence that you need, the time that you need to come back into the world. Many of us are not even ready for this. Many of us really needed, relished, found it very natural to be on our own and solo. So I look forward to exploring this with you, Tracee, today, because I think this is a very important topic for this moment in time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Radiant Rest is, it's basically my new favorite. As you can see, it's dog-eared, posted it. It's a very good sign. It walks us through the depths of yoga nidra, yes, but what the sort of practice really entails, the mystery of it. Looking at the table of contents, page 7 in the Roman numerals, the journey through consciousness. In part 2 of the book, you refer to this as welcoming yoga nidra. And I think that's a fantastic way to begin this conversation around this book, because it is kind of a welcoming of a friend, this practice into my home and into my house. And you even, as you break up part 2 into 3 parts, the second of those 3 is called the householder's flow. And I thought it might be nice to start with, like, okay, we're all normal people running households of various different sizes and intensities. What does it mean to welcome yoga nidra?
Thank you so much for that beautiful question, because it really gets to the crux of why I felt I needed to answer the call to write this book, right? And that call was really about relationship with practice. And that yoga nidra, we think about yoga nidra as a technique, but there's the state of consciousness, there's yoga nidra as a goddess. And I really had to look at my own practice and realize that over these 20 years, I had actually cultivated a relationship with the practice, the technique, and the goddess. And it wasn't a linear plan. It wasn't anything that anyone laid out for me. It was really because I kept doing the practice. I was devoted to the practice. And so this relationship was kind of born out of devotion. And so the welcoming that I'm referring to in that chapter is really the realization that this deep rest and this technique and the state of consciousness, it's always there. It's always available. We just have to slow down enough and realize that there's so much in the waking state that is actually veiled from us. And that becomes revealed when we can slow down and when we can be still and when we can do this practice of yogic sleep. So that's the welcoming.
I want to highlight the idea that when we're sort of moving around throughout the day in our lives, there's so much that is veiled from us. I find this to be true now more than ever. As I get older, I can feel the sort of cycle shifting, downshifting. I can feel the body even downshifting. But I notice it's easier to rest, it's easier to nap, and it's easier to perceive, get this, when my brain kind of shifts into new available information is now coming in, details at 11. Like I can feel that so much more clearly now with this practice and as I age. And I'm just so tickled by it. Like I feel like I'm being let in on a secret.
It is a secret. It really is a secret. It is like, you know, we're in this waking state. There's so much that we do not have available to us in this consciousness of the mind that has its machinations going and going and going. And then when we move into these sleep-based practices and rest-based practices, there is wisdom that is revealed. And there's also this kind of awareness that is running through, that is always awake and aware. But I would say that it's, to how I experience it, is not like an alertness. It's really more of like a soft awareness. And then when we have practiced enough and we come back into the waking state, we bring that soft awareness with us. And so we no longer have to always be in Yoga Nidra to receive the creativity and the inspiration, because we're just more aware of those transitions and more aware of, like you just said, when the shift comes in the brain, when the shift comes in the body, when the shift comes in the day, where we see it. We don't just move because we're in the doing all the time.
The one thing you said just now dawns on me that it's important to highlight also, which is the availability that we suddenly have once these practices are, relatively consistent. Even once a week, I find is effective, even though I prefer it much more often.
Mm-hmm.
The availability of this creative state.
Yeah.
I have found that since bringing this into a regular routine in my house, in my life, in my body, creativity is like flowing
Mm-hmm.
fluidly in a new way. Mostly because literally every time I slow down and I sit still and I go sit on the couch out there, or I sit on a chair and I just, do nothing but sip tea for a little while or cacao, all the ideas come.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
You know what? That is the space of the void that is both full and empty. That's I really feel like rest has become my muse, my creative muse. I couldn't have written this book if I was not practicing Yoga Nidra twice a day while I was writing.
Of course.
And so there's a portal to so many things in this practice, and creativity is just one of them. So there's a part in the book where I talk about Benjamin Franklin and Thomas and Einstein, where they would basically nap, and they would nap with like metal balls in their hands and have like a pan underneath them. And the moment that they were dropping off, they would open the hand and the balls would wake them up. And then they would start writing, and that's where they would get all their creative ideas. So they knew something about this void, this transition, this space between, the space between waking and sleeping. And that's the place that we really start to know and live and love in when we're practicing Yoga Nidra.
Yeah. Do you personally have any practices for kind of jarring yourself out of that place and making notes as they did?
I wouldn't say jarring. I think that, yes, very similar. Because when I read that, and through some other things that I was doing, because I love the practice of journaling, I love the practice of self-inquiry. And when I was training in Yoga Nidra, there was never any space between the end of the practice and like moving into lunchtime, right? Or moving into like leaving for the day.
I noticed that too. Yeah.
And I always felt like, wait a second, there's something magical right now. Like I can feel this bliss in my cells. I can feel the inspiration. I want to capture it. I don't want to run off to the next thing. And so on my own, I kind of started doing that, just journaling and free writing after practice. And then I read in Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, about Benjamin Franklin, and I did more research and found out that Einstein did the same thing. And so when I was writing the book, I said to myself, I really want to write this book from the space of the creativity that comes from Yoga Nidra. So my writing room was a Yoga Nidra nest and a writing table and my harmonium. And I basically that's how I wrote the book. So
Wow.
the answer to that is yes.
Yes. Yes. You've broken up the third part of the book into several practices. And to my utter, total gratitude, celebration, and glee, you have actually indicated that you are uh, encouraging teachers to teach directly from this book,
Hmm.
which I've done. And I love giving you credit. It's so nice just to say, this is from Radiant Rest by Tracee Stanley. Please enjoy. And then I walk them through the practice. How hard was it to parse down the various different nidras that you've practiced in your own experience to these few that you've put into the book? They're all so potent, but I would imagine you had to sort of edit some things out.
Mm. You know, it was interesting. It was an interesting process because when I thought about the practices that I wanted to offer, knowing that awakening is not a linear process,
Mm,
but that there should be some sort of, you know, uh, intention behind it, not just kind of airy fairy.
yeah,
I really wanted to use the koshas as a model and to address each one of the koshas in each practice, as well as the elements, right? And so, regardless of if someone has an understanding of yoga nidra, or they're not a yoga teacher or have never practiced yoga, that there would be something in each practice that they could relate to. There would be something in each practice that they could hold. And so that was really what I used as my model, is the koshas and the elements.
got it. And what's the one you find of the practices in the book, which obviously our viewer will probably get their hands on at some point? What's the one that you feel like you turn to the most, if there is such a thing?
That's a really good question. I actually did this poll in my book club to ask people which practice they were doing the most. And the one that most people were going to was the altar of the heart.
Ah, that's a nice one. Totally.
Yeah. And then the other one was the grounding practice,
The
right?
grounding practice is the one with the protective rings.
It's so the protective rings everyone is using. I get so many emails about the protective rings, but the grounding practice is the one where you are repeating the mantra lam
Oh,
and
yes.
feeling where the body is connected to the earth and allowing the earth to hold you. And
Yes.
and as I was writing those practices, I was always thinking about the progression. Like, the first thing that we need to do is really allow the earth to hold us and know that we can trust the earth, right?
Mm,
And as we go through that journey of consciousness and we start to become aware of, oh, I'm actually not the physical body. I'm actually feeling prana now, this life force. And
right.
life force is the thing that guides us back to source.
Right. That makes sense. And when you practice, we're definitely going to have a practice today if you're with us.
Yes.
When you practice on your own, do you do readings before or after, or do you just set the nest, take the practice, and then do some writing at the end?
Yes. I set the nest. I self-guide myself probably 75% of the time.
Mhm.
And then right away, I do a mind map, and then I do free writing after.
Talk to us about mind mapping. I think this is so freaking fascinating, and I love this.
Oh, I love mind mapping. So I will, in the center of the mind map, you kind of start with a circle. And let's say that circle is, I'm going to just say devotion, because that's the first thing that came to my mind
Okay.
right now. And then you just write, okay, what's my obstacle? So there's many ways to do this, but the way that I do it is I will write, what's my obstacle to devotion,
Mm,
right? What's my obstacle to devotion? And what's feeling in my heart right now? What am I feeling right now? And then I put that in there, right? And then I start to think about, okay, what are the things that I actually have to do today that are related to my devotion? And then I start to look at the obstacles and I see, okay, is there something in this to do bubble that actually is addressing the obstacle? And if there's not, what can I do that is going to be an antidote to the obstacle? And I'll add that to the mind map. And then I'll look at how I'm feeling. And if I'm feeling a certain way that I maybe want to adjust, I'll add into the mind map, what is the antidote for this feeling? How can I shift this feeling? How can I expand this feeling?
Hmm.
And then that just becomes a map for my day,
Yep.
you know? So there's many ways to do it, but that's like the very simple version. And it's been a practice that I've been doing daily for years.
I simply love the idea of, as a daily practice, set the nest, take your Nidra, mind map a specific word that perhaps comes to you, or perhaps you choose a card or whatever,
Mhm.
and then set the tone for the day this way. What a beautiful way. I find myself picking, I have a few different little decks near my meditation space, and I'll pick a card. But the idea to mind map just after Nidra is super solid. I'm going to start to incorporate that too.
Yeah, it's a game changer.
It seems, it seems of the self-guiding your practice. I just want to go through the 10 steps. I'm on page 174. Um, I still fall asleep every time I try, but I do try. And
Mhm.
it's always so sweet. You know, I wake up and I'm just like, oh, did it again. Um, you take us through 10 steps that are really beautiful. And I think that this is, I think, one of the most seminal aspects of the book. And there are so many for me. Um, you set an intention. Here's the question. You set an intention for remaining awake, for keeping the part of you that is aware awake, while allowing the rest of your body physiologically to rest.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about how these steps, and if you wish, I can, of course, read the first line, how these steps sort of have crystallized for you? And
Mm.
yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask about this.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, the very first time I self-guided myself, it was not intentional. It was no one ever told me you should self-guide yourself through yoga
Sure.
nidra. It was really like I'm laying down. I want to do a yoga nidra, but I'm actually don't feel like getting up to get the recording. So I remember the steps. I've been doing this for long enough. Let me just guide myself.
Yeah.
And what I found in the guiding was literally this two-pronged awareness that came forward, which was I am the one that's doing the guiding and I'm being guided,
Ooh.
but I'm still in this place of like, there's not a doing really about it. There's a softness and the awareness that kind of came from that of just feeling the energy body like really powerfully. It was a game changer. And it was something that I said, okay, I'm going to do a sadhana around this for 90 days. I don't know why I picked the number 90, but it was like, I'm going to just do a self guided practice for 90 days. And I feel like I learned so much about Yoga Nidra. I learned also the power of Sankalpa, right? Because Sankalpa, we need that Sankalpa to be able to stay awake and aware, because that's where the intention comes in, is to be able to say, okay, I'm creating a Sankalpa that I'm going to remain awake and aware. And I think that a lot of times what happens is we get to this place in our practice that we really recognize as being like the liminal space between the waking and the sleeping. We notice that our body starts to become heavy. We notice that our breath starts to change. And we may even have the thought like, oh, I'm in that place where I could either fall asleep or I can remember my sankalpa and stay awake. And sometimes we just need to fall asleep. And sometimes we can say, okay, I'm going to keep this thread of awareness going. And so for me, the crystallization of the self-guided practice has been, for the first maybe 10, 15 days, I actually was doing it with my elbow on the ground and my arm up. So
Right.
anytime that I started to fall asleep, my arm would move. And within 15 days, then it was like there was something that happened that started to shift that. There was another practice that I actually brought into my nighttime, and that was the practice of the 108 countdown that's actually in the book. And so that practice is basically you start counting down from 108. And when you feel yourself falling asleep, you just remember the number that you were at and you allow yourself to fall asleep. For me, I don't sleep dead through the whole night. I'll usually wake up 1 or 2 times. And so when you wake up, you just remember, oh, I was at number 54. And then you start counting back down from 54.
Wow.
And then when you wake up again, you do the same thing. And then when you wake up for to actually wake up for the morning, you remember the last number you were on.
I love that.
That practice,
That's cool.
yeah, that will help you. I believe that if you do that practice consistently for a week, I don't recommend doing it for 90 days or even 40 days straight. But if you do the practice for a week and start to get to the point where you're like, oh, this is not as difficult as I thought it was going to be, I'm remembering the numbers, you will be able to stay awake by self-guiding.
And conversely, you'll be able to fall asleep more quickly when and if you wake up in the middle of the night, you remember where you were and you just take it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. Very, very good. I have only just one more question, and I really want to talk about this with you because I think this is your, if I may, I think this is your life's work, and I think it's some of the most valuable work that I've encountered in my 20-something years in this yoga universe. Yoga Nidra as a path to freedom is, it seems like, oh yeah, those words are here again. But when you really boil those words down and you get all the sort of water off and you're left with just the seminal essence of what that means to you, what does it mean when you hear those words that Yoga Nidra is a path to freedom?
It means so much because on the one hand, Yoga Nidra is a full system of yoga. The only asana that is required is the asana of us being in a comfortable, supported position where the earth is holding us and we trust that the earth can hold and support us. And at the same time, Yoga Nidra is the pathway to, I feel, all of our liberation, because we get to reclaim the birthright of rest. We get to reclaim our power, which is consistently being undermined by society and culture as it is, that wants us to keep doing and keep working and work ourselves into the ground for what? And I feel like during the pandemic, people started to realize how exhausted they were in the midst of not doing a lot, or doing a lot less than what they maybe had to do before. And of course, there are many people who had to do even more because you had to take on so many jobs that were previously being outsourced, whether it was teacher or cleaner or, accountant, whatever it is. And so I think that liberation is that ultimate liberation that we talk about in yoga, not only the spiritual liberation, but the liberation from all of the ghosts that haunt you. Liberation from the thoughts that are the obstacles. The obstacles that go into that bubble are usually thoughts. They're not things like flat tires.
Right.
So that's the liberation. And once we actually liberate our own selves from our own negative thought constructs, and we see how they were constructed, because we get to see the energy of the samskaras and the vasanas and how they've informed us. And all of these things can happen because they can be revealed to you in Yoga Nidra, especially when you practice the free writing and the journaling afterwards, because that strengthens our ability to remember. The reason why we have to keep learning all this stuff is because we don't remember.
Because we keep forgetting.
We keep forgetting because it's convenient for us to forget. And so the question is, like, what's convenient for you to forget? Yoga
Right.
Nidra is going to wake you up to that.
Right. The
And
paradox, you go to sleep and you're actually waking up. So
yeah,
fun. So much
that's
fun.
it. So that's I feel the deeper layers of liberation is that when we see that in our own selves and we know how to heal that, we then have tools to heal that outside of ourselves in the world.